Welcome along to the Pastor's Heart, and on the run-up to Australia Day, we're talking today about the relationship between evangelical leaders and evangelical missionaries and Australia's Indigenous population. We're going to be doing that with the historian Stuart Piggin, who along with Robert Linder has just authored this masterful new work, Attending to the National Soul, Evangelical Christians in Australian History from 1914 to 2014. But before we come to Stuart, we created the Pastor's Heart to serve Christian leaders by encouraging, equipping and creating a space just to remind each other that no matter how much or how we might feel at any point, we're actually not alone. And especially for the senior leader or the missionary on the other side of the world, away from our families, or the rural pastor doing it tough. And each week we ask a senior leader about their heart and what they're doing practically to serve our Lord Jesus. And with your help, we can interview more people, spend more time preparing and producing each episode, and reach more Christian leaders as well. And so there are several who work on the Pastor's Heart, filming, editing, mixing, and bringing it to you. At the moment, their wages are not being covered, and we would like your help if you could go to patreon.com/thepastor'sheart and help us out, even with $5 a month. That'd make a big difference. Then we can pay our editor and actually do the whole job better, and well, that'd be great. Now, Stuart Piggin, thanks so much for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
And look, thank you for your work here. And you released it in December.
Yes.
But as I've been reading it the last few days, I really just have been overwhelmed by the massive amount of work that has gone in here and that stands behind each page of that book. And it's going to be a phenomenal reference point for those of us in Australian Christian leadership for decades to come. And there's so many strands to tease out, but I just wondered today if we could, just in this run-up to Australia Day, talk about the Indigenous history here. And we'll come to the Indigenous history in a moment, but could we just start with, what did God do with your heart as you were doing all this work over these last few years? Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Well, these two books, I mean,
There's two, yeah.
They're two volumes which are on Australia's evangelical history. And they're two volumes because it just got too big to make to make into one volume, so we just divided it into two. But they took 30 years to write. So there's an enormous amount of research going on. And I began to write them when I was master of a university college, Robert Menzies College, and I was the head of the chapel at that time. So I had the experience of being a pastor myself, which I'd always wanted.
Yeah.
I'd had a great experience of the Lord when I was in Fig Tree Parish.
I remember speaking on a weekend away for you.
Yes, that's right.
It was a great time. Yeah.
And so I was eager to have a church of my own. And I think then I discovered how difficult being a pastor is. And I stepped down from that about 15 years ago, and I've been at Macquarie University since, heading up a research centre. But now I'm in a church where I'm looking at things from the other side, and I'm wondering, how I can help the pastor to be effective. And one of the conclusions that I've come to, because one of the things that's always been on my heart, is how to bring about revival in Australia. Mm-hmm. And it's a topic which really has stirred my heart for many decades. And I've been wondering about what it really would amount to in Australia today, because in the 19th century they were reasonably frequent, but nowadays they're harder to spot, although they are the sovereign works of the Lord, and he's always doing good things.
You start this book with the story of Mary Bennett, and she was a clear Christian, and you say that she warrants nomination for being the most outspoken and determined evangelical of the century in the area of Indigenous affairs.
Yes.
Well, that's a big call.
I do want to say, Dominic, that I appreciate your homing in on this particular aspect of the book. I mean, there are lots of themes.
There's lots of themes. Yeah.
But you have decided to talk about probably the most important, I think, in the sense that this is the biggest challenge in Australia today, to do something about Aboriginal reconciliation. It's the biggest challenge because those who are not Aboriginal have got a lot of apologising to do, and we haven't done it particularly well, and yet it's something which, if we do, it will pay enormous dividends. Mary was herself the product of a strong Christian heritage. She was her grandfather was the Church of Scotland minister in Scotland, and her father was a pastoralist in Queensland who knew his Bible very well. He was the one who was responsible for launching an Anglican diocese in the northern part of Australia. And when the new bishop, who was an evangelical, asked him, what he should do about services, this father of Mary Bennett knew what psalms he should have in his services and so on. So she was very knowledgeable about her Bible, I think. When her husband died in 1927, she, having written the life story of her father, who was celebrated for having an enormous holding where the Aboriginal people were allowed to stay within the bounds of the settlement, and they got on splendidly well. It was something which really worked, and she couldn't understand why this couldn't be duplicated all over Australia. Instead of all the struggle between the settlers all the time and Aborigines, why can't they just live together like this? So she held them up as a model. Now, some secular historians say, she only did that because she felt guilty about the fact that her father had this paternalistic attitude towards Aborigines. But I think in actual fact it was something which really worked. And she was eager to duplicate that across Australia. So when her husband died in 1927, she became a passionate advocate for Aboriginal concerns, and she was absolutely fearless. She was a person of incredible courage, and that's why I think that's why I've said that she was so outspoken. But I must say that if we're right in our claim that she was the most determined and the most outspoken, then she was one of a good crowd, because a lot of the evangelical missionaries were very determined and very outspoken because they had to be. Some of them were very powerful. I mean, like the Gribbles, Ernest and John Gribble, for example, in the 1880s and again in the 1920s. Ernest Gribble was at the Coniston massacre in 1928, and he was incredibly critical of the way of what the whites had done and so on. And
well, tell us what happened with this Coniston massacre, and then we'll come to his reaction.
Well, it's just that this is an important massacre. I think, like all the massacres, there's a great argument about how many people were killed, because of course the object of the exercise on the part of the people who committed these atrocities was to make sure that
nobody knew about it and it was minimised.
Minimised, and that's why historians have so much trouble in being quite positive about these things, because not much has been written, and that's why you have the so-called black armband and the white denial and the whitewash historians. The black armband people say these massacres were plentiful and appalling, and the denialists say you can't prove it. There's nothing much written about it, and after all, historians rely on written testimony. And if you can't come up with written testimony, you can't really claim that these things were as major as you claim. So that's a sort of big division that goes on.
So what's your view?
My view is that the massacres were plentiful and appalling, and they happened when the white settlement spread. It was a sort of a frontier, and so wherever the white person intruded into the Aboriginal lands, depriving them of their only means of living, because they took the watercourses and they got rid of the kangaroo and they molested their women, the Aborigines had to fight back, but they could never win. And so there were these constant bloodbaths. And the important thing about the Coniston one was it might have been the last one which received any sort of formal police support. There was still a lot of trouble between Aborigines and police after that, but that was the last one, I think, which was really an appalling, deplorable.
And you were just about to tell me about Gribble, and as a Christian missionary, how he entered the fight on behalf of the Indigenous.
Yes. His father had done a similar thing in northern Western Australia in the 1880s and got into all sorts of strife with the powers that be. See, the missionaries didn't get a lot of support, often from those who were not church people. And Gribble was, the father, John Gribble, was ostracised as a result of this and told to, and he was removed, and the same with Ernest.
Was the reason they didn't get support, I'm just thinking, if they were a minister and they were relying on the pastoralists to pay their salary and they were preaching against the pastoralists taking the land, I can imagine tension between the missionary or the minister and the pastoralist. Was that it, or was it something different to that?
I think that was basically it.
And yet there are a number of stories, Gribble included, where the Bible guy stood up for the Indigenous person.
In the first volume, if I could just refer to this, there is, if I could just exegete it, there is a marvellous sermon which the first vital Baptist minister in Australia, John Saunders, preached after the Mile Creek massacre in 1838. And why this is so interesting is that what he obviously had was, he had a public theology.
Yeah.
He understood the relevance of the gospel and the scriptures to the world in which we live now. It wasn't all about something which is going to happen in the future. It's something which happens now. And his text was, "Behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain."
Isaiah.
And what he said was, we have shed their blood. We've not been fighting with a natural enemy, but have been eradicating the possessors of the soil. And why? Because they were troublesome. Because some few had resented the injuries they had received. And then how were they destroyed? By wholesale, in cold blood. Let the Hawkesbury and Emu Plains tell their story. Let Bathurst give in her account, and the hunter render her tale, not to mention the south. And we shall find that while rum and licentiousness and famine and disease have done their part to exterminate the blacks, the musket and the bayonet and the sword and the poison damper have also had their influence, and that Britain hath avenged the death of her sons not by law, but by relation at the atrocious disproportion of 100 to 1. How he ended was, he said, we are guilty here.
Mm.
We are guilty here. We really must do something about this. We must...
So what year is this?
This is 1838.
And this is Central Baptist Church, Sydney, or...?
That's right. This is the Baptist Church in Sydney. Yeah. And this is a famous sermon. And nowadays they have a John Saunders lecture or sermon every year in honour of this amazing guy. And you might know that Peter Adam
he's one of my heroes. We had him on a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
He gave one of these lectures, the Saunders lectures, where he said, the Lord has allocated people to live in different parts of the world, and he allocated the Aborigine to have Australia. We whites, we're incursive, we're invaders. We've got no right to be here. The only right we have to be here is if the Aborigines let us stay here. We should get out unless they allow us to stay. It caused a great sensation, as you can imagine.
So what was your reaction to that?
To Peter's sermon?
Peter's sermon, yeah. I mean, it was a very significant address.
Yes. Well, I mean, you talked about visiting the Northern Territory and the impact that made on you. In 1978, I think it was, I visited Groote Island.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd just come back from India. And that was the first time I'd ever been out of Australia. And India made an incredible impact on me. I was reeling with culture shock and all the rest of it. But when I got to Groote Island, I thought, I have never been among a people who are as different from me as these people. Not the Indians. Aboriginal culture is just so different. No wonder it's taken us 200 years to begin to understand it. You can begin to appreciate that if I had been living there a couple of hundred years ago, I might have made exactly the same mistakes as my forebears did. It's all very well for us to be judgmental about these things, but if you get that sort of perspective, you can begin to understand why it really happened, I think.
Tell me about William Cooper. Well,
William Cooper was the product of a genuine religious revival in Malaga, in the Malaga Mission in Echuca in Victoria. And he was obviously a very bright customer. was very able, and he was a passionate evangelist. But in 1937, which was the year before the 150th anniversary of the white settlement, he asked that Australia Day, the 26th of January, 1938, should be made a day of mourning, not a day of celebration, a day of mourning. And of course this created a great debate. David Uniapon, who's on our $50 note, he didn't think this was a good idea. He thought we should be celebrating the good things that have happened.
So there's two different schools of thought.
Well, that's the thing about, there's no such thing as an Aboriginal position on anything. It's always very complex.
So they're both Indigenous people?
Both totally Indigenous people with these different perspectives on these things. And out of the Day of Mourning idea in 1938 came NAIDOC.
Which really was a Christian initiative.
Oh, well, they're all Christian initiatives. They're all Christian initiatives. Mabo is a Christian initiative.
Well, let's do NAIDOC, the Christian initiative, and then we'll do Mabo, the Christian initiative.
Well, it's just that all the people who are involved in these things, the people who campaign for justice, they're nearly always Christians. You see, if you ask the question, when you stand back from all of this, what sort of judgment should we make about how effective we've been? Then while we have failed hopelessly, nevertheless, we have also seen marvellous things that have happened. It's just, they're both things happening together. And that's why it's so unfortunate to just make these big generalisations about it. But Henry Reynolds, who is the great historian of all of this, he says all the humanitarians that he writes about in his great books like The Whispering Heart and so on, Whispering in Our Hearts, they're nearly all evangelical Christians, almost without exception. You'd hardly find anybody who's not an evangelical Christian who's involved in this sort of work. Even the Catholics are not nearly as strong. I was surprised by this. I thought the Catholics would be, sort of equally strong with the Protestants. But the Protestants, I suppose because they're more numerous, but also because they believe in missions.
Come back to William Cooper, because you were telling us about him.
I just wanted to finish this point if I could, because another historian like Kenny, he wrote that book about The Lamb Enters the Dreaming, which is a famous book on this subject. He says, nobody who was a product of the Enlightenment, no person who just has a secular attitude to these things, a secular philosophy on these things, not one of them ever, he said, that I have found, came up with the idea that the Aborigine could survive. The only people who believed that the Aborigine could survive, he said, were these evangelical Christians. Now, there's a secular historian saying that sort of thing for you.
Well, it was Mary Bennett who wrote the book The Australian Aborigine as a Human Being.
Yes.
I mean, just that somebody had to write that book is breathtaking in this day and age.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's very important. What that means is that she has understood the biblical anthropology. Yeah. She has understood that God has made everybody in his image.
In his image, yeah.
That he is made of one blood, all the nations of the earth, so that there will be the elect of every nation in heaven. I mean, it's going to be a multicultural heaven. Everybody's going to be there, and we've got to get used to the idea that there are going to be a lot of Aborigines there, and also she's very strong on the biblical understanding of justice and mercy, but she adds two significant things, which not all the Christians understood, and that is that civilization was understood as a Western term, and she talks about civilization's victims, because civilization didn't do a lot of good for the Aboriginal people necessarily, and I think that's an important thing to grasp when we think about what the white missionaries were trying to do. Whenever they made mistakes, they normally made it in the name of civilization. They were always they couldn't begin to believe that what they saw in Aboriginal culture had anything to do with civilization. Now,
they did have a sense of wanting to civilise before gospelise,
yes,
before preach the Christ, I think.
That was a big debate. 50% of them thought you had to civilise before you Christianised, and 50% of them said, no, you just preach the gospel.
Just preach Christ. Anyway, back to William Cooper and the Great Petition. Tell us that story.
Yeah. Well, Cooper not only wanted to have this day of mourning and so on, and he petitioned the king because he said the governors aren't looking after us. I'll just go straight to the king. And he got into the way of being a very effective activist and advocate. And so it was he who, when Hitler burnt down the synagogues and so on, the Holocaust just before the Second World War, it was he who came out and condemned this and said the Australian government should be condemning this as an appalling assault on Jewish people. And the Australian government said, we don't want to touch this. This is too difficult. But now it is Cooper who was honoured, I think it was in 2010, the creation of a chair of resistance
by the Jewish
people. So the legacy of what these people did just goes on for decades.
I was fascinated by one quote, that missionaries were, however, deeply implicated in the practice of removing Aboriginal children from their mothers. Can you just, we've just kind of looked positively at some of the missionary work for a minute, but that kind of raises what was going on there.
My understanding of that is that this is a very good example of the effect of of identifying civilization with the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So they looked at these Aboriginal children, they saw them in poverty and squalor, and they thought, we'll only be improving their lot if we remove them from this. And the idea that it was uncivilised to remove children from their mothers, for some reason or other, that was not stronger than that particular belief, that because it didn't look right, they should remove them. Some of them also had the belief that you had to take the children away from the adults in order to remove them from the cultural influence of the adults, so that you had a chance of bringing them up as Christians. So they did, I'm afraid, they were involved with government in this very unfortunate removing the children business, and it kept on going until relatively recently.
On the positive, one of the quotes that jumped out at me reading your book was Aboriginal people were among the most evangelised people on the planet and more likely to be professing Christians than white people. Can you drill down on that quote for me?
Yes. At the 2011 census, 76% of Aboriginal people identified as Christians, whereas 61% of the rest of the population identified as Christians. And it has been said that Aboriginal people are the most evangelised and missionised people on the globe, in the earth. I mean, you said you wondered about leaving what you're doing here and going helping. Well, if you had, you would have joined a very large workforce in terms of the proportion of missionaries to Aboriginal people is very high. But it's sort of required that large task force in order to begin to understand what to do about the problem. But because you had so many missionaries, some of them have been incredible heroes, in my opinion. Some of their wives have been incredible. The things that they've endured for the sake of the gospel and taking the gospel to Aboriginal people.
Who are your heroes?
Just incredible. Well, I'm a great admirer of Len Harris, who was John Harris's father.
Mm-hmm.
John Harris, the author of the best book on this subject, One Blood, great title.
Mm.
And Len's wife, Marguerite, they went to Groote Island, and at a time when it was not considered important, it's so embarrassing to talk about these things, not considered important to translate the Bible into Aboriginal languages. He was doing that on Groote Island. He was doing that on Groote Island. CMS, about a decade later, picked up on that, and it became a commoner thing. I mean, you do have missionaries almost at the beginning, like Threlkeld, who made important translations. But by the time he'd finished his translation, the Aboriginal people he'd made it for had all died out.
Tell you a little cool Threlkeld story. So we're talking about Wabagal, just the language of the Newcastle people.
Yes.
And my dad, who's retired, has been teaching himself Wabagal. And so he's spent probably most of the last 3-4 years teaching himself Wabagal. And
he could only do it because of Threlkeld.
yeah, well, the only documents written in Wabagal are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Book of Common Prayer. Yeah. And so he has gone through and gone through and gone through. He's found mistakes that Threlkeld made.
Isn't that exciting that your father has been involved in that? So how did this happen?
Well, he, I mean, you were talking before about that that pillar near your house,
yes.
And the terrible things that were done to the Sydney tribe. And Dad used to work at Sydney Uni and catch the train, walk from Sydney Uni, from Redfern Station to Sydney Uni, and see the poverty amongst the Indigenous people on that walk. And on those walks, people would be begging, and he'd say, "I won't give you money, but I'll pay you for information." And he asked people to teach him their language. And so, like when he was 30 and 40, walking to and from Redfern Station each day, he was gradually learning the Indigenous language of the Sydney tribe. Although
this is your language?
Yeah,
the Gadigal language?
Yeah. And so he's actually become, I think, one of the foremost experts on the Gadigal people's language. And in fact, he every Friday goes and teaches a group of Indigenous people their own language because they've lost it, that particular group. And in fact, the welcome for country that's done in that language, Dad wrote. It's lovely, actually. It's you are strangers today, but not tomorrow.
Oh wow! Oh wow!
And anyway, he's moved from the. I mean, he did it working at Joseph Banks Diaries, and I think you've been looking at that too.
Yeah. You see, you're strangers today, but not tomorrow. That is a positive, encouraging, optimistic view of the future of these things.
Yeah.
If we do it right for a change.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty exciting.
Let me ask you a last question. Let's go to the 2008 apology to Indigenous people.
Yes.
And one of the lines that jumped out at me in your treatment was that you were quoting Jeff Treloar saying that only an evangelical Christian could have written that great apology that Kevin Rudd gave. Now, there'll be some people here who don't know the apology story. So maybe you could tell the apology story and then fill in some of the theological analysis.
Well, as you know, for decades, the need for an apology was being expressed, but no politician was sufficiently brave to actually do it. And in 2007, the first thing that Rudd did on being elected was to give this apology speech, where he apologised comprehensively for the history of these things, the damage that had been done to the Aboriginal people, and there were tears everywhere. And the question then is, and this speech has been recognised as being Lincoln-esque, and obviously one of the most important speeches given in Australian history. Where did it come from? And those who listened to it thought this has got the cadence of the scriptures and the prayer book about it, you know. And they talked about how important Kevin Rudd's Anglicanism was in all of this. But in the book we drill deeper, and we know that Rudd didn't write the speech entirely on his own. It was actually written by an evangelical Christian who worked for him, Tim Dixon by name, who'd been he'd been the captain of Trinity Grammar School, and he was working for Kevin Rudd at the time. And he rang up a great prayer warrior, Glenda Weldon, and said to her, "Please pray for me while I write this speech." And she prayed for him, and she wrote to me and said, "Kevin Rudd might have, changed it and so on, but Tim wrote that speech." So what it is really is the combination, I think, of evangelical Christians and Anglican Christians coming together to produce a formulation, a way of conceiving of the apology which would have been impossible without Christian thought, which leads to this final concluding thought, if I may, and that is that it's very important for Christians to remain in the conversation because all the vocabulary is there. I mean, what we need is reconciliation, Christian word, atonement, Christian word, forgiveness, Christian word, apology, Christian. All these things are the Christian perspective is what is needed in this debate.
Stuart, thanks so much for coming in and sharing all this with us. That's been terrific to hear from you, and what a service you've done for us in attending to the National Soul, and of course the earlier version, the part one of the story, the Fountain of Public Prosperity, Evangelical Christians and Australian History. Now, you've been listening to The Pastor's Heart, and let me just say that next week it's a complete change in tone. We're going to be thinking pastorally how to handle the whole subject of when there's a suicide in the congregation. Now, I'm imagining that some people will want to tune into that as they think back, well, did we handle it right? Could we have done it better? But actually, you don't know when it's going to happen. And if it does happen, you're going to be caught completely on the hop. And so we're going to be talking to an expert about how to handle that situation. And so I hope you'll join us next week on The Pastor's Heart.